Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Nick Gallo for Upping Your Game. How's it going, Nick?
Good, man. So glad to be here. I love this. I love the series we're doing.
So today, Nick, I wanted to take up from reactive to predictive, how AI is rewriting the compliance playbook. And this, in many ways, is everything we've wanted from compliance from the first time one of the regulators, this in the form of the Securities and Exchange Commission, started talking about data analytics. And we've been moving forward towards that literally since 2016 and the key energy FCPA enforcement action. That move towards data analytics picked up, but it was always in a detect mode, always in a reactive mode. And it was not thought of as something that could be predictive. Nick, I think we're at the point now with AI where we can really move to that predictive mode. Any initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we talked in the last session about trying to compress the time between identification of something and like actions that were taken or actions that we are taking. And the predictive piece is kind of flipping that on its head and trying to look forward a little bit. And I think it ultimately comes down to the ability to find relationships between data points and kind of start to build a model that we can kind of bring a hypothesis to and start testing. This is what sales teams do all the time. This is what CFOs do all the time when the CFO has to build a model for the next year or the next 3 years to support a bunch of maybe an investment or just the board budget or whatever. That's just a bunch of nested relationships between different financial accounts. And I think when we can start to understand, like the model never works, right? In finance, if you're doing an acquisition, you build a model to sort of justify it. But like models are to finance what like writing is to life. Like writing helps you to just think. It helps you get your thoughts on paper and think in straight lines. Building some kind of a financial model, which again is just a bunch of algebra and building out a bunch of relationships between these different components, it can help you understand like how this machine might work. And so I think if we get too caught up in, oh, I don't know if these relationships are going to be right, then that can sometimes prevent us from like even taking that first step and building some kind of mathematical model. But I think we have to not think about it that way. We have to understand it's an iterative process and you have to get something down on paper. Otherwise, you're just kind of flying blind, or at best, you're kind of driving in the rearview mirror.
Nick, I found it interesting that, once again, the regulators, this time in the form of the Department of Justice, has really been leading us in the compliance field to this point. And I want to actually go back to the 2020 evaluation of corporate compliance programs document where the DOJ for the first time said compliance professionals must have access, or CCOs must have access to all data silos within an organization. And you talked about it, I talked about it, we talked about what that meant in terms of having access to data analytics. But now in 2025, looking back, it seems like those guys were maybe a little bit ahead of the curve in being prescient about where compliance was going and how they were going to get there. The 2024 update to the ECCP further specified that compliance had to integrate data analytics, not simply into a retrospective detection mode, but also into things like culture, for cultural assessment and culture improvement and culture monitoring. And that was the first time they told us, hey, compliance, you need to use data to help improve your culture. And looking back now, it seems to me they were a little bit ahead of the curve. Then, of course, they hired Matt Galvin, who helped them build out their data analytics capabilities, certainly at the Department of Justice. And so I think the regulators, it turns out, have been a little bit ahead of us. And when the regulators suggest you do something, I think the business world listens. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think these regulators who are kind of helping to pull the industry forward in our space, that's a real asset for us. A lot of regulators in other spaces are often kind of like trying to catch up to the business. And so that's kind of been flipped on its head in our space. And I think that creates a lot of opportunity for us. We must have access to these data pools. Okay, fine. Like these data pools exist, but you still have to go and get them. This is like a great kind of, I don't want to call it a sledgehammer, but it's a great catalyst to get some of the access that you might need. But then again, it's not just having access to the pools. You got to do something with that information if it's actually going to direct your activities and direct your efforts within your program. So I love it. It seems kind of innovative. Maybe that's the wrong word, but it's definitely pretty rare that like a regulatory body is like truly pulling the industry forward.
I really love that word catalyst. I wish you'd told me that about 3 months ago because I would have stolen it and used it.
It's my new word of the day. That's why I said it. Yeah.
But that's absolutely what it is. The DOJ acted as a catalyst. And then with the president's executive order suspending FCPA and investigation and enforcement, I said we were at an inflection point, but we had the DOJ catalyzing us to move forward with data. It all leads me to ask you to maybe give some thoughts on the power of predictive analytics, once again, drawing on your business experience, because you had to do that when you were looking at business. You had to do that when you were assessing companies that your PE firm bought or was in part ownership in.
This is going to sound maybe a little counterintuitive, but I feel like the power in it, there's two layers to the power in it. Like the base layer is like the extent to which we're actually able to predict something. And that's fine and good. The quality of the predictive analytics is going to vary depending on ultimately like the R score, the true correlation between the variables in the multivariate equation that you might be building. I think the second layer of what it allows you to do is it allows you to really speak the language of the business a lot more and show up like a business person. Like every other department is trying to do that same thing. Sales teams are doing their commits for an entire quarter. CFO is, like I said, building a budget for the entire year. The CEO is going on to an analyst call and they are predicting what's going to happen over the next quarter and what earnings are supposed to be. So when we can show up and use that same kind of muscle, I guess, it really helps to demonstrate our business acumen. And again, it's not about accuracy of the model, because like you're going to iterate through the model and like you're going to continue to like refine that model. You're going to continue to understand at a deeper level the extent to which you're like playing with a model or trying to be predictive with your analytics. You're going to get a deeper understanding of the true interdependencies and the true relationships between all these variables in this multivariate equation. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in that second layer that I just don't want to pave over and blow past. Like I was talking to somebody on our podcast recently, the ethics experts, who has in his new company, compliance lives in the risk function. And that turned on so many light bulbs for him. And this guy has been in the industry for a really long time, but like his learning curve has been steep in this change. And he's learned so much in terms of like how to better show up like a business person. And like when we want a seat at the table, we have to speak the language of business and we have to do the things that the other quote unquote business people in these other departments that more foundationally employ these kinds of tactics are doing. So I think just starting to think about, okay, I've been running this program for a long time. I have all these little pools of data that are like underneath my umbrella. I also have the ability to get other pools of data through persuasion or through influence or through showing up with this guidance from DOJ or whatever. It exists out there. If we can start pulling some of those things together and just start kind of trying to play around with them and say, okay, when this happens, what else happens in some of these other areas? It can really open our eyes to some things that might be like a little bit more effective, like from an efforts perspective. And I think it allows us to show up show up more as like a business person. I think that's really what the next mile for ethics and compliance is. Really kind of speaking the language of business, being a part of the business means speaking the language of business and not only having actual understanding, but also exhibiting those kinds of behaviors so that we can get what we need to have the impact that we know that we should be having.
Let me focus on sort of general point two you raised, which was the iterative process. You have access to the data. You've integrated compliance into your business operations. And as you said, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to have challenges. You're not going to have everything right the first time. Could you speak maybe to that iterative process? What do you use in the monitoring and in the continuous improvement?
I think we do this like in our own lives all the time. Like to the extent that you run your personal finances on some kind of a budget, you know that at the end of the year, you're probably going to have December's probably going to be a bigger spend month than, I don't know, another random month because maybe you're buying a bunch of gifts, or maybe the summertime is a bigger spend month because you're going on some kind of a vacation. Something is kind of happening. And so what are you doing? You're kind of using predictive analytics. I know this is like a very pedantic like example, but you're using predictive analytics in that case. I mean, I did this when I first kind of went out on my own and you set a budget and you're like, okay, that was freaking totally wrong. I spent way more on this vacation than I thought, or I spent way more around Christmas than I thought. So I need to alter my budget. So it's an iterative process because it's an ongoing thing. It's nothing in compliance is like truly set it and forget it. There's no light switches in compliance. There's just a bunch of little bonfires that like we have to keep stoked. And I think you can start to, I was playing around with something like this in preparation for this episode, but you can literally upload a bunch of case management data, a bunch of like litigation data. I kind of created some dummy data with dates and events and say like, to the chat GPT chat that I was working in, find me some relationships between these data sets. And it's going to spit some things out. And some of the things that came out were like stupid, but some of them were like, oh, okay, cool. That's something that like I should monitor. So if I'm starting to see a bunch of, I don't know, we roll out a training pardon me, and we start to see a bunch of reports about a particular topic, there's some relationship, there's some kind of assumption we can make on like where what this risk is going to translate into, whether it's litigation or something like that. And so I think like you have to start with something like going back to what I was saying before, like just building a financial model helps you to think through how does this business work? Like when you're analyzing a business to buy, you start to build a model and you start to change assumptions and see like how that ends up flowing through the financial statement. We can do a corollary of what I just described in many aspects of compliance. If we're opening up a new division, there's some assumptions we can make about the risk of that new division in that certain geography based on historical data or based on things that we've seen in other organizations. And then it's a question of, to your point about monitoring, or to your question about monitoring, it then comes down to monitoring that model and saying, okay, like what's the true predictive power of this model? Which of my like underlying assumptions may need to be dialed in, which need to be altered? Let me give you one more quick example. We hired a bunch of salespeople last year. And so we built a model that said, okay, how many people are we going to hire? What's the cost of those people? How long is it going to take them to get ramped? And like how much sales from each of these individuals can we expect? Those are like four like pretty critical assumptions. And so we built the model, and of course the model was like wildly wrong, but it gave us some indications as we monitored that throughout the year of which of those main four drivers that I just articulated were the strongest forces. If we're mid-year and we're not hitting our sales numbers, it's some confluence of these four like underlying variables that were wrong. But it's not 25% across each one. What we found, 80% was driven by like the head count. And then the next biggest one was our assumption on how long they took to get ramped. So again, that's just like an example of a very simple model and a very simple monitoring exercise to get a better understanding on what's actually driving the outcomes that we're going for.
So it really sounds like each step that I've tried to articulate in terms of developing the model, integrating it into the business operations, training and rolling out, iterating and improving it. I don't want to say they're separate steps, but they may be as equally important.
Yeah, they're absolutely. No one of those steps, would I say, is more important than another. Like those are like, that's the bouquet of steps that's necessary to get the most out of this exercise we're talking about. And it's really about kind of increasing the expected value of the model's accuracy. But again, I was watching this podcast about a guy, he was like I think he was like an army sniper, like a special forces guy. And he was saying like, as a sniper, in wartime, you're not doing the actual thing that you see in the movie where you're like doing the calculations and all that. You do some like quick high level calculations, you fire a shot and you're like, okay, I'm actually off by a couple of inches. So I need to make like a slight adjustment. That's him doing kind of predictive analytics in real time, if you think about it. But it's not like just the fact that every single shot, every single sort of prediction from your model is not 100% accurate doesn't mean that this exercise is like a waste of time. It means that's how the exercise works. You know what I mean?
That's also a great point. That's how it works. Let me end by asking you, as I'm a lawyer and a lawyer by professional training, background, and work as a compliance officer, how can a chief compliance officer educate himself? Should he go down and talk to his CISO, his CTO, if the company has data scientists? How does he begin to think about the data part of this predictive compliance?
Kind of on brand for this podcast series. This is something I've been doing over the last year. If there's a topic that I want to learn about, like I'll carve out an hour and I'll start a new chat and I'll just start asking questions and start getting information back. And I end up having this conversation with ChatGPT, and I've like actually learned a lot because you can add so much context to it. You can add like how much, hey, I'm struggling with this, or I really want to start doing predictive analytics. Where can I get started? Like just starting with something like that, like Perplexity and ChatGPT have almost like replaced Google for me, particularly on like research topics, because it can pull from so many sources and boil it down. And I really love Perplexity because it gives you references to these sort of underlying pages or resources that it checked to dive deeper. So I would start there. If you feel like you're not even a white belt on data analytics or predictive analytics, I would absolutely start there. And then I love what you just said. You can also leverage that ChatGPT to say, I want to have some conversations with a couple of folks inside my organization. I want to talk to the CISO. I want to talk to the CFO to get smarter on it. Give me a list of questions that I can ask them so that my time with them is extremely valuable. And it's going to spit out 20 questions, and you can pull from those to get that conversation going. So I just think like the excuse for not getting up a J curve because we haven't had access to something in the past based on our background or whatever, like a lot of that stuff is out the window. I think we said on one of the earlier episodes, there's no excuse to not put the ball in the net. That's our job. Our job is to figure out a way to be effective and figure out a way to have the impact that we have to have. Everybody has similar constraints, whether it's a company that's in the world's most ethical companies that I kind of historically naively thought, oh my gosh, those folks have everything. They got all the budget they need to do whatever they want. But then I've talked to some of those folks on the list, and it's the exact same conversation I have with everybody else. And so we can't, again, this is all about being high agency. This is why I love this industry so much, because there's such an opportunity to like grab the steering wheel and steer your department where it needs to go. So I would say start there and just start iterating through it. Like your first model is not going to be right. Your first model, you might look back on it a couple of years and be like, oh my gosh, how stupid. But that's how you have to start. You got to start like a toddler, kind of falling down a little bit if you're ever going to learn to walk.
So let me end with this hypothetical. You are a CEO of a multinational, multi-billion dollar corporation, and your chief compliance officer comes to you and says, I want to integrate compliance into the business operations of this company, along the lines that we've been talking about today. What, as CEO, would you want to hear, at least on an initial pitch?
My first question would be, why? What's the point? Why are we going to spend these resources, time, whatever on this, and what are we going to get for it? So I think leading with that answer, or leading with some sprinklings of that answer, to at least show that, for that chief compliance officer to show that they've thought about that, I think does a lot to elevate that person and elevate the conversation. I'm always talking about these two layers of communication. That second layer, I think, is really critical to get the engagement that's necessary for that person to potentially get what they want. So I would absolutely start there. Start with that why and try to connect it to what I care about, which is going to be what? It's going to be faster growth. It's going to be higher employee engagement. It's going to be better client experience. It's going to be like more cash flow ultimately for the business. Like those are kind of the big four that I think every board and every executive cares about. Those are maybe articulated in different ways, but I think connecting into the strategy of the business and letting that be the constant in every single conversation just does so much to elevate that function. Because like other people, whether it's ops or whether it's HR or whatever, some of them are really good at that and they end up getting more of what they want, because at the end of the day, it's just like a conversation between two people. One person has something that the other person wants, and that other person is trying to persuade that first person to give them what they want. That's all this exercise ever really is. And so if you're not going to take that by force, then you have to take that through some kind of influence or some kind of persuasion. So I think just connecting down to the things that like matter most to that adversary, which is in this case, the strategy of the business or the objectives of the business for the year or over the long term, that can do a lot to elevate the conversation and kind of get some stuff unstuck. But if you're just coming in and you're just saying we should, for me at least, I'm going to say, prove it. What do you mean we should do 1,000 things? It has to be a compelling argument. And not to rabbit trail us here, but we should be the best at argument in our space, because we have to use logic and persuasion in order to get what we want. We many times have like a power imbalance, like we might not have the positional authority that we would like, But positional authority only kind of goes so far. That relational authority or that relational equity that's built on trust and that's built on influence, that's the name of our game. So I think we need to bring that to every single interaction up and down the stakeholder stack.
One of the contributors to my book, Upping Your Game, Carl Hahn, said the first question he would always ask is, what's the business value?
That's it.
And
that's the question.
I heard you say just that.
Yeah, because executives, the board, they have a fiduciary duty to steward the resources that have been to steward the resources of the business. So solve for that, empathize with that piece. And I think you can speak some language that's going to show that business value up front. But if we don't start talking about business value until the third or fourth, like back and forth, that's a weak conversation. That's not a very persuasive conversation. If you can pull that forward, it just builds a lot of credibility and I think makes you more influential.
Well, Nick, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. If our listeners want more information, I hope you'll check out my new book, Upping Your Game. I'll link to it in the show notes and it's available on Amazon.com. Nick, I can't wait to see what we come up with next week.
Same here. See you next time.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet. Every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.